You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 421 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm covering news about North Korea, Israel, and Iran. You find the show online at thelibertarianinstitute.org, where the show, along with the daily news roundup that I write, are featured in the right side column of the homepage. So when you go to thelibertarianinstitute.org, you can share the show from there. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. The show has its own podcast feed, Foreign Policy Focus, and is also on the Libertarian Institute All Podcast feed, along with The Scott Horton Show, Pete Quinones, and Phil Gibson, all previous guests on this show. And if you want to be a donor to the show, you can check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. First thing I have on today's show is the Pentagon's JEDI contract. JEDI is the acronym for the program. That is essentially the Pentagon's cloud that they're trying to have a company build. I've covered this as it's, developed on the show. So, if you're a longtime listener, you'll probably know this wrap up. I'll try to go through it pretty quick. Companies like IBM, Oracle, Microsoft, and Amazon were all trying to get in on this contract. I believe it's initially worth $5 billion, but you know how these Pentagon contracts go, probably through the roof. So, these companies are seeing tons of dollar signs. Of course, if they end up building the cloud, then I'm sure that's going to be an excuse to tell the Pentagon when they're building stuff in the future, like, hey, we already developed your cloud, so it made sense for us to develop this or that. And so this is a really big deal for these companies, and they've been bickering, about different kinds of influence other companies are having. For example, at one point, a Pentagon employee who was a part of the acquisitions or I guess decision team for the JEDI program was actually then offered a job and accepted it, I believe at Microsoft, but I'm not positive on this. And then at the same time was still working at the Pentagon, advocating for particular decisions that would lead his company, which I again believe is Microsoft, but I may be misremembering, or it could have been Amazon as well. That would have led to that company being more likely selected. So, that kind of influence and just all kinds of other stuff that, there's been these kind of particular backroom deals made or this way or that way influencing. Anyways, everybody claims that the other parties are cheating to get this contract. Well, it's finally been awarded to Microsoft, and now Amazon is officially appealing that decision. The first thing I'll point out here is that look at these companies claw over each other to try to get a piece of this Pentagon contract. It tells you how much it must be worth that they're, spending, I'm sure, a ton of money in all these kind of legal and publicity fees and, making up whatever kind of stuff they need to try to get the Pentagon to buy, their project and award them the contract. You also have to be concerned, and I point this out time and time again on the show, is that the more these tech companies get kind of in the big business of the Pentagon, the more, their company bottom line and all the profits that they're making and, hitting their numbers is about getting these contracts from the Pentagon. So what do? They'll start to give money to think tanks, just like the weapons makers do. They'll hire their own lobbyists to go out there and advocate for policies that continue the need for big budgets in the Pentagon, so more war. And these companies, maybe unlike just a weapons maker, also has kind of a role in how commerce, in the case of Amazon, Microsoft is what we use to get all of our information, through the internet for a lot of people, using Microsoft like Windows and PCs and stuff like that. Look at other companies that may one day contract with the government, Facebook or Twitter, those companies maybe wanting to censor content that's seen as negative for the Pentagon, or, be more willing to take lists or suggestions from the Pentagon on that, are all really negative things that could happen by these companies getting more in bed with the Pentagon. So that is a real concern, especially when this contract has such a big bottom line dollar and so many companies seem very invested. Again, Microsoft, Amazon, IBM, and, again awarded, the ability to build this cloud for the Pentagon. All right, so some news on Ukraine. Russia returned the 3 ships that were seized in the Strait of Kerch incident. So, again, this is something that hasn't been brought up on the show probably in 3 or 4 months. What happened is you have the Black Sea and then the Sea of Azov, and the landmass kind of separating the Sea of Azov from the Black Sea is on one side Russia, and then on the other side the Crimean Peninsula. And then there's a lot of coastline along Ukraine and Russia within the Sea of Azov. Well, when Russia, seized Crimea after, the U.S. coup in 2014 in Ukraine, I won't go down that whole road. Everybody kind of knows my take on that if you listen to the show, that, this wasn't the great theft that the Western countries portrayed as. So anyways, Russia ends up controlling both Crimea and the Russian Federation. So the small strait there, the Strait of Kerch that leads from the Sea of Azov to the Black Sea. Both sides of this gate were now controlled by Russia. Some Ukrainian, I believe they were military ships of some kind. Maybe they were more like Coast Guard than actual, armed up Navy ships, attempted to enter the Strait of Kerch from the Black Sea without going through whatever protocols Russia had put in place. Russian ships then intervened and stopped the ships and seized them. It doesn't seem like, the Russians used a whole lot more force than was necessary. It's not like they blew these ships out of the water and killed everybody on board. I think they did, kind of crash into the ships and fire some shots at people on board. So those have now been returned, those 3 ships. And that's, I think, overall another step in the process to try to end the war in Ukraine. Now that Russia has seized Crimea, and for all intents and purposes, Crimea is a part of Russia. I mean, whatever kind of, Washington think tank can slap whatever they want to on a map, claiming that Crimea is still part of Ukraine or Ukraine territory stolen by Russia. But the fact is that, Crimea is Russia now. And so that's really not what's being decided, but it's the area of the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, where there's been a ceasefire for a few years that's pretty shaky. There's still some sniper fire and shelling that goes on along the border, but generally has held for the past couple of years. But now there's real steps in the right direction as the new Ukrainian President Zelensky is working particularly with Putin in Russia, and then Macron and Merkel of France and Germany to find some kind of permanent solution to this. And again, the Russia returning these ships, I think, is seen as kind of a goodwill gesture because Russia does bat the rebels in the east of Ukraine. All right, going on to Bolivia here. Protests are growing as the people of that country, I guess, are upset with the military coup that happened and ousted the president. The latest number I've seen are 23 people have been killed, but I will say that that number is a couple days old. Kind of like what I'm going to talk about with Iran later. They say that 23 people have been killed, but I haven't seen anything specific to whether these people were protesters or if maybe 1 or 2 of the deaths were by police or, somehow members of the coup there. The coup government is expelling people that it claims to be, I guess, kind of a threat to its legitimacy. So anybody who may inspire protests, they've expelled a bunch of Cuban doctors, Venezuelan officials. Now they're targeting members of parliament of the opposition party and journalists who are not towing the coup government line. So a very dangerous situation right now in Bolivia. On North Korea, the clock is ticking. Donald Trump has about a month and a half now here to get something done or to really get moving towards a deal with North Korea. And it seems like the North Korean position right now is pretty firm at the U.S. has to put their hostile policy towards North Korea on the table or no talks will begin. So viewing this, I guess, from a solely, kind of Western perspective, and certainly the narrative put out in the mainstream media, is this whole time Donald Trump has been being duped by Kim Jong-un by having all of this summits because it's bestowing this mystical legitimacy on Kim Jong-un. And I think kind of what Kim Jong-un of North Korea is now saying, that actually him meeting with Donald Trump is more politically beneficial to Donald Trump than it is to Kim. And there's no sense in him having another meeting for a photo op, and any, new summit has to be based on some kind of real deal. Now, the U.S. and South Korea canceled some war games, and again, this is being portrayed in the Western media as a goodwill gesture. I think that's maybe somewhat too kind to the United States. I mean, we're kind of in this official agreement right now with North Korea where there are no war games on the U.S. and South Korean side, and in exchange, North Korea isn't engaging in any nuclear testing, which would be, I guess, long-range missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and nuclear weapons. And so I think from the North Korean side, they're kind of saying, well, you guys are just doing what you already agreed to do. You're not really offering any solutions here, and so we're not going to meet with you. Whereas the U.S. is saying, look, we canceled a war game, and especially the media narrative has been, the North Koreans are saying that it's still not good enough. Well, of course it's not. A lot of people are writing some pretty good articles. Someone by Daniel Davis, Daniel DePetris, saying that 2020 could very quickly look like the situation in 2017, where Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump go back to trading threats over Twitter and, towards a more hostile policy. This is a real concern. And I will say this is another negative of the impeachment of Donald Trump. Again, you're going after him for Yemen. I'm not going to say that, the timing is bad because he should really be doing a deal with North Korea here. No, screw that. If you're going after a genocidal war, the next president can hopefully get something done with North Korea. But, for some pretty much fake accusations that they have going on here, that being a distraction away from the North Korea thing is really disappointing. And that is, I guess, supposed to run now through the end of the year. And I even saw this, I think Jimmy Dore was talking about it. I thought it was hilarious that apparently the Republicans now have the idea that if they actually drag on the Senate part of the impeachment, which would be the vote to remove Trump from office, they could actually keep a whole bunch of senators who are running for the Democratic nomination in D.C. when they're supposed to be in Iowa and New Hampshire for the primary and caucus. And so that really just seems to be the biggest kind of game being played in D.C. and everything. And kind of funny in a way, that the Republicans are now trying to exploit the impeachment of Trump and extend it for political reasons. But the real downside to all of this, of course, is that we do have a deadline at the end of the year now that Kim Jong-un has set. And if Trump doesn't offer something real to North Korea, a real meaningful way of, I guess, changing the American hostile policy towards North Korea, then I don't think something ends up happening by the end of the year. Afghanistan, from January through October of this year, the U.S. dropped over 6,000 bombs and missiles on Afghanistan. This is a record high, beats the record set last year in 2018. And so, I know you can't defeat an insurgency with bombs and missiles, but hell, you would think if the U.S. is dropping a record number of them, then maybe they would be making some wild temporary gains in Afghanistan. But if anything, it seems like we've seen the opposite, and the Taliban continue to slowly take more and more territory from the Afghan government. So the prison transfer between American, Australian, and Taliban hostages ended up happening. This was 3 high-ranking Taliban members, including, I believe, the leader of the Haqqani network, and he also apparently ranks about number 2 in the Taliban, and then 2 other senior commanders, and then an American and an Australian professor were released. They were captured over 2 years ago at a university in Kabul. While the U.S. gave its support for this, it does seem that this was a deal between the Taliban and the Afghan government, and so maybe that's a step towards these sides finding some way to start to ramp down this war that, again, is seeing so many bombs dropped and record numbers of civilians dying as well. 12 people were killed in a car bomb, 12 civilians, 3 children in Kabul this week. Afghanistan continues to just be an absolutely nightmare in a lot of cases. There's this ongoing war the U.S. is dropping bombs out of the sky, ISIS is running around the country, and then the Taliban are also suicide bombers and some pretty dark actors themselves. So it doesn't seem like, there's a good situation for the people to ever be in, and it's just a lot of times choices between bad and worse. Now, the Afghan government is declaring victory over the Islamic State Khorasan group. As I've talked about on the show, ISIS-K, as it's known, started when a group of Pakistani Taliban, Tehrik-e-Taliban, not necessarily aligned or related with the Afghan Taliban, were forced into the Nangarhar province of Afghanistan as refugees of Barack Obama and the Pakistani army's war against the Tehrik-e-Taliban. I guess once in Afghanistan, they picked up the ISIS branding and kind of took up the black flag there and declared war not only on the Afghan government but also on the Taliban, which has created a situation where maybe not in joint operations, but certainly in beneficial situations, the Americans, the Afghan government, and the Taliban have all carried out attacks against ISIS-K. So, certainly seen as the worst actors by everyone. A lot of credit, I'm sure, will be taken by the Afghan government and the Americans should, ISIS-K actually have been defeated in Afghanistan and not just maybe a little bit depleted or something like that. Or this isn't just a publicity stunt by the Afghan government. But the Taliban, I'm sure, are, responsible for a lot of the defeat of ISIS-K. Now, part of this story says that 600 Islamic State fighters and their families have surrendered themselves to the Afghan government recently. If that's true, I'm sure there's a much bigger story behind it that just hasn't been told yet. And I will hopefully remember to tell it on the show once somebody reports on it. Now on to Israel, where the big news is the United States officially changing its stance on the West Bank settlements from being, I guess, opposed, against, in violation of international law to that not necessarily being the case. This is a big move. It's a big policy shift on the United States, but very much in line with the general Trump administration policy on Israel, and that is to take steps kind of, in a way like ceremonial, more bureaucratic type steps, but nonetheless that give more international legitimacy to Israel's occupation and oppression of the Palestinians. This has included no longer, I guess, considering the Golan Heights as in any way Syrian territory, and now just territory the Israelis have. And then this step to, say the settlements are not illegal. Now, does this actually change anything? No, of course the settlements are illegal. Of course it's awful oppression, and it shouldn't be a matter of international law or whatever else to say that this is morally wrong and needs to stop. I'm not sure if there's, a certain argument that the Trump administration is using here, or if this is just, the general position that they're taking now, and that's the way that they're, gonna say it. I don't think that maybe they were presented evidence by Netanyahu and suddenly they're like, oh, well, now our legal calculation is this. This is, I think, pretty much just an ideological move. Now, this, kind of presents an interesting situation in Israel, as there's kind of ongoing power battles for who's going to be the next prime minister of that country. And Trump making these, steps and statements is often considered, and I think, is correct, that this is a boon to Netanyahu, who, if the United States continues to give, more legitimacy, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, stuff like that, then the people of Israel will think the U.S. is a stronger ally, and, maybe they could just go ahead and outright annex the rest of the Palestinian territory. And I think their plan would be to kick them off rather than to just kind of make them full citizens of Israel. With each of these three big steps, it seems that more and more people are realizing that the two-state solution in Israel is dead. I thought Kalman Barkin on the show made an interesting argument, just kind of pointing out that how many settlers were in Gaza when, they were told to withdraw from there. I believe that's in front of Operation Cast Lead. And the reaction in Israel to that means that there can never be a two-state solution because too many settlers would have to leave the West Bank, and that would just be the most unthinkable thing to so many Israelis that it could just never be done. And so in a sense, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world in a utilitarian way for Trump to take this step, as it is removing the U.S. as having any kind of pretense of an impartial actor. I think anybody who would think that Trump's deal of the century is going to be a fair deal for the Palestinians has to be kidding themselves. I don't even think that this is probably something the mainstream media and the foreign policy establishment blob will be able to kind of pick up and sell, especially since I'm guessing the never Trump resistance may be okay again if this deal of the century ever drops, which I kind of at this point doubt it will. But overall, the U.S. has not been an impartial actor over all these years, yet it has kind of on international stage got to, alongside Israel, make unacceptable deals to the Palestinians, pretend that they're acceptable deals, and then pretend that the Palestinians are just the most unworkable people on the entire planet, and constantly just undermining potential peace, and they're just anti-Semites who can't stand the thought of a Jew living on land once owned by an Arab, so they're never going to accept anything, when really that hasn't been what's been offered to the Palestinians, and in fact it's much closer to being the complete opposite of that. So that may be kind of the one long-term optimistic way to look at it, is that the U.S., I really do believe, is removing itself from having any ability to be the team negotiating here, which is kind of asserted itself in this position all these years. That said, I'm sure it's going to create some violence in Israel, as the Palestinians will rightly stand up and say that who cares what the Americans think? The UN, the EU, and everybody else in the world still knows that, this is absolutely a travesty and an occupation, and it must end. All right, some stuff on Iran. I'll first go ahead and just generally say that Iran continues to move away from its commitments in the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and even by the JCPOA has the absolute right to do so because the Americans walked away from the deal. And so now they're reducing their commitments to the deal. While Iran is, I guess maybe you could say, upgrading their civilian nuclear energy program, they have not taken any steps that would suggest Iran is planning to build a nuclear weapon. The most recent step that Iran has taken away from their commitments, the additional safeguards and protocols that they placed on their civilian nuclear energy program, was to take the Fordo nuclear facility, which by the JCPOA was being converted into a research site, and once again turn it back into, I guess, what you would call more of a production site, where they're just enriching uranium up to 20% and using more upgraded centrifuges to do it. So had the U.S. stayed within the JCPOA, none of this would be happening, but because the U.S. left it, Iran is, not committed to the additional protocols anymore, and is just kind of following the NPT and not building any kind of nuclear weapon with their civilian energy program. Another part of the JCPOA Iran is no longer in compliance with is the tonnage limit on heavy water. They're over 130 tons now. This is something that I believe the United States has sanctioned. So even if Iran were trying to meet this commitment, they couldn't do so. Now, the problem here is that the United States says, and this has been particularly the policy of the Trump administration and Undersecretary of State Mike Pompeo, Iran is not allowed to enrich uranium, which isn't something that, you could impose on a country. I think a country would have to have the capability to enrich uranium in order to kind of self-sustain a nuclear energy program without having to import fuel rods or, nuclear fuel. You would have to be able to enrich uranium within your own country. Iran is a country that has been isolated by the world at times, and certainly by large parts of the world even now by U.S. sanctions. And so I highly doubt that they're going to completely sacrifice their enrichment capabilities and, not have any of these facilities anymore. And of course, the demand the U.S. is making is like telling Venezuela, oh, you're not allowed to pump oil anymore. Why? That's not the kind of energy that you're allowed to use. It's bad for the environment. So Venezuela is no longer allowed to pump oil. That's obviously a ridiculous thing for the United States to demand, But because in this case, there's been so many, rumors and lies going on for so long about Iran having a nuclear weapons program, Iran was even willing to limit their nuclear program just to get the United States off their back. But again, this is only an energy program. Now, protests have broke out in Iran, and, this is obviously every time by the United States we support the protests. The protests are trying to overthrow a corrupt regime and, bestow every great thought and feeling towards the protesters they can. It seems this time the protests started off because of increases in the price of fuel. I think this was a pretty significant increase. Maybe this is because American sanctions are starting to bite on Iran, and they're having to look at the government as other sources of revenue, or just kind of cutting down on the fuel use by the country. So the people are suffering. The Iranian government and the clerics have talked about giving, cash payments to the poor people to alleviate the protests. A report by Amnesty International said the IRGC cracked down on the protests and 100 people died. Again, didn't exactly specify all 100 people were protesters, but that over 100 people and maybe up to 200 were dead. You assume the majority, if that was the case, were people mowed down by the Iranian regime. As always, I'm guessing there's some influence going on, U.S. influence going on here, and that the United States will look to capitalize on these protests, both in the international media and within Iran, in an attempt to undermine and potentially even overthrow the Iranian government. I'm definitely, kind of putting an asterisk on that amnesty number for Iranian protests. I think it's possible that is true. The IRGC certainly put out that they were planning on cracking down if protests continued, but it is a very large number to happen all over the course of a couple days. A few updates on Syria. Turkey is saying that the Syrian Kurds have not fully withdrawn from the safe zone, and they're threatening another attack against northern Syria. Russia has denounced this. Hopefully it doesn't happen, because that would be a whole new complication we don't need in the Syrian civil war. More car bombs continue to go off in the Turkish-controlled areas of northeastern Syria. Of course, these are jihadist rebels that Turkey is allied with in these regions. So, seems likely that they're probably the source of the car bombs to me. But at the same time, the Syrian Kurds are being oppressed there, and so maybe they're using kind of guerrilla and insurgent tactics. But they're killing a lot of civilians. Whoever is setting off these car bombs, 1 or 2 a week, again, in these areas along, and mostly in the Turkish areas of northeastern Syria. Russia has taken control of a former U.S. airbase in Syria. This is being portrayed as, the biggest and most disgusting defeat in American history. I really don't understand what was supposed to happen here. Were the Americans supposed to stay at the base forever, completely, disassemble the base, and, truck all that material back out of Syria and leave it as if the Americans were never there? Because the alternative to that, is eventually either Assad or Russia were going to, retake control of the areas of Syria. And, the Syrian state controlled by Assad is a sovereign state, and Putin and Russia are the, invited allies of that country. And so, of course, it made sense that one day they were going to retake these areas. And the U.S., again, didn't want to destroy their whole base or, take it apart all the way and truck it back out, which probably, cost-effective wise, this was the cheapest way to handle it. This was inevitably going to happen, and it isn't a defeat and isn't a big deal. A couple really quick stories on Libya. The Haftar's forces have bombed areas in Marista and Tripoli. These are kind of 2 key cities left that are not under Haftar's control in Libya. The strikes in Marista apparently targeted Turkish armored vehicles that were being delivered. The strikes in Tripoli targeted a biscuit factory and killed 7 people, including 5 foreign workers. The UN has said that these are potentially war crimes. Well, of course they're war crimes, but the fact that the UN might look into it is something new. The US condemns this, and I believe, comes out and condemns Haftar and Russia, who has supported Haftar in the past. Of course, I should say Haftar, for those of you who don't know, is the general who for a long time lived right outside of Langley in the United States and eventually returned to Libya after Gaddafi was ousted. He tried a coup backed by the CIA that didn't work out, so that's why he was in the U.S., but went back and took a bunch of territory in the country and now controls, I don't want to say almost the whole thing because there's pretty significant resistance to him and he hasn't been able to advance on Tripoli so far. But nonetheless, he is, the field marshal, the general in control of most of the country there. There's this interesting thing. We condemn Russia and all these countries for supporting Haftar, but at the same time, the U.S. is kind of doing the same thing. In Haftar-controlled areas of the country, there's Islamist state forces, and the United States has been bombing those, at least claiming to kill 43 in 4 separate strikes over the last 10 days of September. So this kind of seems like an operation that, the Islamic State is probably not helpful to whatever government, territory that they're in, likely to wreak a lot of havoc. I'm sure they don't love Haftar. Then the U.S., attacking and taking out these people would be a boon to Haftar. All right. That's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Hope everybody's enjoying it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, Twitter at KYAAALE, Facebook.com. There's a group, Foreign Policy Focus. I think that's it. Have a good day.